I didn't know what kind of information you wanted from me. I am a senior lecturer at A&M. I've been teaching for a number of years, so I love to teach. And so how does that work into the museum? Well, I got into the museum and the history the old-fashioned way. I married into it. My husband had the interest in the history, and he collected vehicles and restored vehicles and all kinds of things like that. So after a number of years, we decided that we needed to start a museum. So we've had the Museum of American GI. It was established as a 501c3 in 2001. Most of you are aware that we have living history weekends. We've had those in the spring for about 15, 16 years now. But kind of new to the town is our building. We got a building up, our first building, where we could actually put all of our displays in for the public to come in. That's been up for about a year and a half. And so since that building's come in, we've been able to do a lot more things. Now, one of the things, the theme of the museum is preserve, honor, educate. That is what we strive to do. We want to preserve the history between keeping the uniforms, vehicles, posters, all kinds of things like that, just preserve the history. But the whole purpose of preserving that is to honor our veterans. Everything that we do at the museum is dedicated to honoring our veterans. Then the last part is to educate the public. We use the vehicles and the various things like that to educate the current kids. A lot of the kids right now, all they know about history or what they know about World War II is what they get in playing computer games, all right? So they know they can come in and identify every single tank that we have at the museum, which, by the way, we have like 5 tanks on display, right? But they can identify them all, but they don't know anything about the history. So we use the museum and we use the posters, the vehicles, and all of our various activities to start educating the kids of what it was like to be a veteran, what it was like to be in World War II, what it was like to be on a Sherman tank in the Battle of the Bulge, what it was like to be on a half track in the island of Iwo Jima. All right, so that's how what we do, or the goal and the mission of our museum is. Now, we are a living history museum. So because of that, I decided instead of doing a boring PowerPoint and just showing you pictures of the museum, decided I would bring some of the museum's collection to you. And that's the reason I have Ryan here. He's going to be, instead of Vanna White, it's Ryan. He's going to be showing everything up for it as we go. But now, one of the things I want to let you know is how many of you have actually been out to the museum? All right, quite a number of you have. We just started our summer hours, so right now we're open Wednesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. On Sunday, noon to 5. So we're open every day of the week except for Monday and Tuesday. All right, so that way it makes it easier for people to come out. We also have a lot of activities, new activities for the summer. Our first new activity is actually going to be on Saturday night. We're starting for the summer months, and then we're going to pick it back up again in the winter time, what we call Night at the Museum. The third Saturday of the month. That is starting this Saturday, then we'll have it again in July, August, and September from 6:30 to 8:30. That's after the normal hours of the museum. After the museum's closed, we're going to open it back up for the public to come in, and this time they get an opportunity to get in some of our vehicles. Normally, we can't let people in the vehicles because of liability issues, and we have to have enough volunteers, but we're going to have all of our volunteers in place so people can come into the museum. They can actually get in and see the inside of our vehicles. We're going to also have our extensive gun collection out so people can actually look at a lot of the items that normally they only get to see on a special event. So if you were interested or you know someone that's interested, the first one is this Saturday from 6:30 to 8:30. We also are starting some new programs coming up in the fall. If you know any Boy Scouts, we're going to be doing a Boy Scout immersion camp. This summer we're going to also have summer camps for kids. We have 2 summer camps for kids. And coming up in September, we're going to be bringing the Remembering Our Fallen, which is an excellent exhibit. It shows a pictorial of every single veteran that has lost their life in action since September 11th. There are 600 pictures on that memorial right now. We're going to have that at the museum on September 11th. So the 15th anniversary of September 11th, we're going to have that exhibit. So we encourage everybody to mark that on your calendar to come in. And our fall event's going to be in October. All right, that kind of gets you what is going on at the museum. I don't want to spend too much time on that. But again, one of the things that we do at the museum is we're a living history museum. All right, so we have a living history detachment. We have people that come out and help volunteer and show off our equipment. Ryan is one of these, and he is dressed in one of the uniforms that he would wear. This is a World War II uniform, one that would have been just a daily wear uniform for a tanker or some, just an infantryman. Okay, this would be how he would come to present our uniforms. Now, we also have, I brought 2 more uniforms. One of the things that's unique about our museum is we have more uniforms on display, particularly women's uniforms, than anyone else. My son was at Fort Lee this summer, and last summer, and that's where the WAC Museum is, and we have more WAC uniforms on display than Fort Lee does. So if you would love to see women's uniforms and the change of that, come to our museum. But I have brought a special one with us. This is bring the wasp. The WASP uniform. This one is very special. This one belonged to a Bryan College Station native, Mary Parker Chatham. She grew up here in town. Most of you that have been here for a long time remember Parker Aston. She was part of that family. When she was young, she became a pilot. Then she joined the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and this was one of her uniforms. The Women's Air Force Service pilots, these were kind of contractors for the military. They were never originally part of the military, but they were ferrying service. They flew the planes around because most of the men were gone. They needed to be overseas or somewhere to fly the planes, but they still needed planes that either had to be repaired or something like that. They had to move from one location to the other. And so that was what the WASP did. There were about 2,000 women that applied to be WASP, but only 1,000 were accepted. All right, so in the course of the time, there were only 1,000 of them. Mary was one of those. All right, now of the WASP, 22 died during the course of flying their planes. Now, what was interesting about that is they weren't part of the military, so the family had to pay to repatriate their body, get it back home. They didn't have military honors. They didn't have the flags on their caskets or anything. So these were women that loved to fly and just wanted to serve their country. Now, in the late 1970s, that kind of changed when the women started flying current planes and they were getting women pilots and they were like going, yay, we have women in our military flying planes. And these women says, no, 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 we were the first women that flew planes. So they got it through Congress that actually at that point they accepted them as retroactively as part of the military. And since then, they've even had some recent things out. If you paid attention to the news just recently, they've allowed women that were WASP to be buried in national cemeteries. They opened up the cemetery in Dallas, so WASP can be buried in that. In 2009, they gave them a presidential unit citation as well. So it was all retroactively, but these were the trailblazers. These women, they were the ones that blazed everything. So again, I just wanted to bring this one because she was a local girl. All right, that was very unique in regards to her piloting. All right, so this is a WASP. We brought another uniform over here. We are also unique in that we have a lot of World War I uniforms. As most of you know, we're coming up on the centennial of the U.S. participation in World War I next year in 2017. And so as the museum, we are currently restoring original World War I tank and some World War I vehicles that we're going to have on display along with our uniforms. Now, this particular World War I uniform, this is a tanker's uniform. He was in the armored group. And World War I was the first time we had vehicles that were part of the war, and it's the first time we had tanks, so it was very unique. So this is the armored patch, right? And he actually has a special one on here. This is the Panther. It was the Toms, because they called them the Black Toms that were within the tank. So this is a very rare uniform, and here's the World War I helmet that goes with it. One of the interesting things about World War I is when we sent our soldiers to England in World War I in 1917, they went with just plain campaign covers. They didn't have helmets. When they arrived on the ground in England, they had no helmets. We bought 4,000 helmets from the English, and then we modified that and adopted it for ours. So that's the reason our doughboys looked very similar to the British at that time, is because we essentially adopted their helmets. Now, one of the cool things about the World War I helmets, which you guys all know, is that World War I was a trench warfare. So they have the trench here, the trench there, the no man's land, and so they were shelling and bombing each other. And so the helmet actually played a role in that, because with this broader brim on it, so it would be over the person's head, kind of cover their shoulders, and so that would help protect their shoulders from the shelling that came from above. And so that was one of the interesting things about that. Now, one of the things we'll see again a little bit later is, I always tell kids, we can learn lots about uniforms. In this uniform, this patch right here is a honorable discharge. So this was the honorable discharge for World War I. This right here was his overseas service stripe. So this person served overseas for 6 months. So they changed as we go to the various other uniforms. But again, it's a lot of things that we can learn just about how the military functioned, what the life of the soldiers were like, just by looking at their uniforms. And again, we have a large number of uniforms on display at the museum. We're working on our second story right now. Once we get that out, then we'll have even more up. You mentioned Robert Ackland. We have all of Robert Ackland's things that his sister donated, and we're going to be able to make a very special exhibit for him and a few other of the Aggies that the families have donated uniforms for. So this is kind of our uniform. That just kind of gives you an idea of what our uniforms are. What I wanted to talk about the rest of the time, if I can manage not to step on the rope here for the mic, the thing, but is I wanted to talk about posters. As in the introduction, it says I had an interest in propaganda posters. I do. I think propaganda posters are wonderful. So I want to give you a little bit of a history of the propaganda posters, how they had a role in World War I, World War II, and how we currently use propaganda posters. Because most people just don't really think of about that in regards to war, in regards to how did we disseminate information, because you have to, again, go back into World War I, into World War II. The kids, particularly nowadays, they don't understand that. You know, they don't even know when they didn't have a cell phone. You know, they don't know anything about a phone with a cord on it, all right? Or a time when you didn't have even the cell phones for long distance. I remember when I was in college and I had the calling card and I had to call home with that, and so it wasn't instant communication with parents that we have now, which I'm sure the kids wish they didn't have. But so the way we had to get information out was they did have the radio, and then later on the advent of the television, but a lot of people, you have to think about, a lot of people didn't have television. So again, it was the radio, it was the movie theaters, and it was posters. That's the way government got the information out. So, and I apologize, I've had a cold for a couple of weeks. My voice is a little bit better now. But I want to read you a quote that was from Charles Dana Gibson. He gave this in April 17th, 1917. Now, you might recognize that last name Gibson. He was the creator of the Gibson Girls. So he says, "We were just finishing dinner when the telegram arrived, asking us to participate as artists to produce artwork for our country's cause. Artwork that would bolster morale, compel citizens to enlist for combat, buy war bonds, conserve resources, and to accept sacrifices and losses for our country. That telegram from the president gave us our focus point. We were to make art that would inspire a nation." That is what the propaganda posters are all about, ways to inspire the nation. Now, the first time we really used propaganda posters were in World War I. And then we continued again in World War II. We don't use it quite as much now, but that's what the start was. So we wanted to have that art to inspire the nation. So in World War I, President Woodrow Wilson, he established the Committee on Public Information 7 days after signing the Declaration of War. So he knew at the very beginning that he was going to have to sell the war to the public. in part because he was elected as a peacetime president, all right? He was elected for peace. Now that kind of sounds familiar. We've been through that where we've elected presidents and then world events have come in and it totally changed the focus of that person's campaign. So that original committee was a person named George Creel. He was a newspaper editor out of Colorado. And of course, it had the Secretaries of State, the Secretary of War, and the Secretary of Navy as ad hoc members of that. Eventually, it just became known as the Creel Committee because he just kind of took it over. Now, a subcommittee of that was called the Division of Pictorial Publicity. That is the one that produced the posters. At that point, eventually that committee, that Division of Pictorial Publicity, that involved over 300 artists. Majority of them were famous artists at that time in the United States, and they were all volunteers and they were all non-paid. So they just provided their work and their services to their government. Now, they were only existed for 20 months, so they only were around from April 1917 to November 1918. They shut the committee down. The armistice was the 11th day of the 11th month, the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month in 1918, but they shut the committee down right around that time because even though we had the armistice, the major battles had finished before that. Now, of that 20 months, they created over 700 posters and for 58 separate government departments. So they were quite effective in regards to the work that they did. Now again, their task was, as Gibson said, to whip up enthusiasm for the war. And again, they had a hard task to do that because of Wilson's original policies to get, that allowed him to be reelected. Now, I'll show you some of those posters and talk more about the posters in just a minute. So we had the posters this in World War I. Well, we recreated this again in World War II. In World War II, it's called the Office of War Information, and it was created about 6 months after Pearl Harbor was attacked. So a little bit afterwards, but again, we did the same thing. And again, the purpose was to inspire a patriotic fever within the country. Now, of all the countries of World War I and World War II used posters. All right, they all used the posters. If we look at all the posters, the best traits of all the posters were they were simple and they had a clear message. So there was simplicity and a clear message, and it was able to elicit emotions or stir emotions. Now, the goals of the poster were kind of varied. So we'll see some examples of that in just a minute. Obviously, finance the war effort. We had that both in World War I and World War II. World War I, it was called the Liberty Bonds. World War II, war bonds. So it's finance the war effort. Also to conserve food and resources. One of the things I tell the kids that come in, all these current kids, they think they're so smart and that we recycle, we put things in different stuff. That started way back in World War I. World War I, the conserve resources, it was eat corn. Eat corn, eat corn, eat corn, don't eat wheat, because we wanted to save the wheat and all of those things to send overseas to feed the Europeans. And it was also to, to be able to package up the food to send overseas. So conserve resources. Then we had sets to promote and enlist people to work in factory production of war materials, and again to instill the patriotic fever to quell any type of careless talk. And those were just a few examples that we had both of those in World War I and World War II. Now in World War II, that was kind of a little bit different in that we also had the advent of women power to get women into the military, women into the factory. So we had additional posters that came in for that. And again, a lot of the posters had either the World War I, the anti-German sentiments, and same in World War II. In World War II, they included the anti-Japanese types of sentiments. So again, the reason we needed to have this is because it was imperative to have the Americans behind the war effort, because in neither war was it absolutely guaranteed that we were going to win. So they needed as the government to get the public behind that war effort to help make sure things would, they could either get all the stuff in the factory or the productions, the things that they needed. Now, you also know that in World War I was the first time they kind of, well, not the first time, but they had the draft. So they were trying to get people to join the effort in the World War I before they drafted them. Now, where did the posters go? Well, they put them in railway stations, bus stops, theaters, schools, any place there would be a lot of people. That's where they put the posters. Now, when we look at some of the posters, there's a variety of styles that we can see between them. And the style varies from World War I to World War II. One of the interesting things about the poster, if you're an art historian, you can get different things out of it. If you're if you're just interested in kind of the history or the public persona, you can get something different out of it. But you look at the art of it, and so from World War I, that art was similar to the art that we would have seen in the famous artists at that time. It was that similar style. We continued that originally into World War II, but in World War II it kind of shifted over a little bit to what we now think of advertising. All right, there was a shift in that design. And there's some really famous posters most of you are aware of. So one that I don't have that I didn't bring was, there's an example again of, it says "Beat Back the Hun." So it has this Hun, or German, and has a bloody hand, and blood is just kind of dripping down on that. That was from the World War I. Now again, they used that bloodthirsty Hun. The reason they used the word Hun for the Germans at that time is a little bit varied. One German actually utilized the word Hun in a speech in regards to rallying up the troops, but it was also more analogous to Attila the Hun, as the way they went through Europe and raping Belgium and various things like that was the term. So they would use that again to elicit that response. Okay, you're familiar with those types of images for World War II, where they used monkeys and Hitler, and they would say that the Nazis, this is our enemy. They would have a bag over somebody's head and they were about to hang them. All right, so those were the type of things to elicit that type of response. But now, a lot of those were used in our war bond efforts. In World War I, there was the Liberty Bond. They raised what was the equivalent of $23 billion in money now to fund that war effort. It was even larger than that in World War II, but both World War I and World War II were almost completely financed either by taxes or the war bond efforts. All right, so they were quite well received. Now, another poster that I don't have, but I just kind of wanted to mention because you guys are all familiar with, is the Uncle Sam, the "I want you," where Uncle Sam's pointing the hand. Now, that was James Montgomery Flagg. He is the most famous in regards to making Uncle Sam's, and that's actually what he's most known for. Now, what was interesting about that Uncle Sam, how many of you know when we started using the term Uncle Sam for the United States? It was the War of 1812. Then it was picked up again in the Civil War. It started changing in the Civil War using Uncle Sam, but it really solidified in the First World War with that poster. And he changed the characteristics of Uncle Sam in that poster. Before that, Uncle Sam was a very passive old man. Then he transformed him into this authoritative figure. So again, that's what these these posters do. They totally change the psyche or the thought of the entire public into the way we still think about things now. Now again, I did mention that in the World War II in particular, they were starting to have a change in the style. There were the traditional artists that wanted to make the posters into war art. So they wanted them to be pieces of artwork. And so we have a lot of examples of that. Then there were the individuals that came strictly from the advertising arena, and they wanted it to be more of the ad. And so there was a kind of a little back and forth of which way the posters would be. And they actually did a study, they did a research on factory workers and other people in the public, and they found out that the stylized imagery was sometimes a little bit too stylized and the people didn't get the message. So by the end of World War II, almost all of our posters were the admin, and that's the way it ended up from after that into the 50s and the 60s, and we're still kind of stuck with that, and it's all because the wonderful artwork poster people didn't understand what they were supposed to be getting from it. They might like it, but it didn't convey the message that we wanted to. So instead of me talking now, I want to show you just a few of the pictures that we have. Guys, we have a lot more of these pictures at the museum. All right, I actually just pulled some out that are not on the wall. All right, because I didn't want to take them off the wall. So I have some better examples than ones that were on the wall. Now, this, when we look at the posters in World War I, and I'm sorry, this one's the smallest one, most of the other ones are bigger. When we look at the posters, we can divide them into different types. So there was always, in World War I and in World War II, there were the join the military. But the join the military, there was never join the military. It was join the Army, join the Navy, join the Marine Corps. Once we got to World War II, it included the women. Join the SPARs. The SPARs were the women in the Coast Guard. Join the WAVES, the women in the Navy. Join the women Marines, obviously the Marines. Be in the Army Nurse Corps, the Navy Nurse Corps. Okay, so the join the military was never just join the military. Like I said, it was always branch specific, and a lot of the iconic ones, particularly in World War I, they were to join the Navy and see the world. That poster came back in the 60s, all right? So a lot of the posters, they recycled. So they were trying to get a new generation of people in. Or join the Marine Corps because they did all these famous battles, all right? So that's where we had. But we have a number of join the military style posters for you to look at the museum. Then the next one that I want to show you, I have two of these. These are the war bond drives, all right? So again, World War I, it was the Liberty Bond. Now there were I believe there are 4, don't quote me on that, I believe there were 4 Liberty Bond drives. In World War I, there might have been 5, all right? But this was for the 3rd Liberty Bond. Now again, what's interesting about this one is here the man's telling this. Again, Uncle Sam, his dad, I'm off to join the war, and as I told you, notice again, he has the campaign cover. He doesn't have a helmet on because they didn't have helmets when they first went, all right? Now, so this was to make it again, to encourage people to want to join the war effort. So again, this was a classic example of the First World War. One of the ways you can, again, if you ever look at these and you're not sure, is that a First World War or Second World War, always Liberty Loan, Liberty Bond. That was the First World War. Just kind of a cool thing out of that. Do you know how hot dogs got their name hot dogs? World War I, because before that we mainly called them Frankfurters. No, didn't want to use anything with Germans, so we switched over. First they called them Liberty Dogs. Didn't quite have a good ring, so they moved it to hot dogs, okay? Now, poor little dachshunds, they kind of went out of favor too. They were called Liberty Dogs. German measles were not called German measles. They were called Liberty Measles. Thank goodness German measles and dachshunds got their name back, but hot dogs kind of stuck, all right? So I also have a poster here from World War II. Now, again, World War II, there were 8 war bond drives, 7 during the war. The 8th one was after the war was over. Now, I picked this one because this one's emblematic of a lot of the war bond drives. It says, let's all fight. So they wanted to make sure everybody in the country participated, not just those that were in the military, all right? So again, you still kind of see the stylized, and there's the factory workers, everything there in the back behind it. So that, again, the idea was to try to get everyone involved. There's some great ones. That one that you can see at the museum has a little boy. He has a Medal of Honor around his neck, tear coming down, and it says, buy a war bond. And the idea behind it is that his father was killed in action and received the Medal of Honor, and you should buy a war bond so no one else's father has to die, Right. So the war bond ones were really, on the whole, some of the most powerful images that they had to elicit that response to get people to join the to donate to the cause. Now, one other part that we have that's a little bit different than the war bonds, but it was the same thing as the war bonds. A lot of people couldn't afford to buy a war bond. So let's say the cheapest war bond was a $20 war bond. So people would buy it would cost $18.75. They would buy that bond. They would hold on to the bond. Once it matured, they would get the $20, all right? But that was one of the cheapest bonds. A lot of people couldn't afford that, so they would buy stamps instead. So there was lots of things to show people to buy stamps, all right? So buy the stamps, and so do your part, buy a stamp. But also, they did a much better job at helping people understand where their money went to. So they made posters like this, so it tells you here, for an 1875 bond, that will buy 1 Garand rifle. Here, 25-cent stamps will pay for 1 aviation first aid kit. Here's one of my favorite ones down here. 3 10-cent stamps will pay for 2 pairs of socks. Right? So not that, again, everyone knew that if I buy the 2 10-cent stamps, that wasn't going to immediately appear as a sock. But it was to help people understand that the money that they invested, what it was going to go for. All right, so to encourage people to that. And they also help to buy stamps. You could buy stamps at the post office. You could buy stamps at certain stores and things like that. Once you filled up your stamp book, then you could turn your stamp book in for your bond. Okay, so again, there was all kinds of informational posters like that to help people understand how their money went. So not only to encourage people to buy the bonds, but to understand where their money went once they bought the bonds. Now, another type of poster we have, and I have more of these on display at the museum, are home front. Now remember, we had this both in World War I and World War II. On the home front, we wanted to have people, not everybody could go overseas, not everybody could be in the military overseas, so they wanted to encourage people at home to participate in the war. The home front posters are divided into 2 types. One is production for factory workers. I didn't have one of those that I could bring, but the factory ones are, you make it, they'll use it, all right? Or you take time off from work. That's the same thing as letting them win, all right? So they were all kinds of things. You know, you don't, your day off means that gives them an extra day of work. So it was that type of thing. But there was also the conservation. So this was one I kind of liked. So they saved everything, waste, fats. So they encouraged women to recycle. At the home, you would take your cooking oil, and they had places for you to go turn it in. So once you turn it in, they would use that to help make the ammunition, particularly in the bombs and the things like that. Most of you are familiar with the conserved gas, conserved tires. Really, the main reason we conserved gas was because if you conserved your gas, that meant you couldn't drive your car. If you didn't drive your car, you wouldn't wear out your tires. And so that saved the rubber. So it worked for both ways. Another interesting thing about this, do you know where the dry dog food, when it was originated? Dry dog food? World War II. Before that, people would get dog food. If you had enough money, you could buy dog food in cans. Didn't want to use the cans for the dog food. They wanted to use the cans to conserve for rations to send to our military. So that was when the dry dog food came, like the gravy train, where they get the dry food and they put the water in it and give the gravy for the dogs. All kinds of interesting, kind of things. So again, we had all of our, we have a lot more of these, but these are the kind of the home fronts. Now, again, for an informational one that I wanted to show you, we do have things, particularly these were very common in World War I. So again, I pointed out of that uniform is here, they wanted to make sure that when somebody joined the military, they got back, they could get the girl. So here it was like the chevron of honor. That was what they were looking at, was his honorable discharge. Okay, so you had to think of the psyche that we wanted the people to join the military. So we wanted to appeal to, besides their patriotic duty, you're a young man, what do you want when you get back? You want to get your girl. And if the girl, what do you want? You want to date the war hero. Right? So they combined these things together to educate the public about the uniforms, what the servicemen, they have it in both World War I and World War II. There's a whole series of posters about this is his resume, and they list all the war battles. Again, very analogous to what we do now with our veterans, that how do you take a current veteran and put the information out about what their service was to use to get a job. That happened after World War I, happened after World War II, but we used posters to explain that to people. All right, the last poster that I want to show you is, again, we have more of these in World War II than we had in World War I, and these were the Careless Talk. They were very much concerned in World War I about spying and espionage. They just didn't make it into posters, okay? I just have not seen an example of posters for that. But in World War II, they made lots of these posters because they were very much concerned about the German spying and the Japanese spying. And so, loose lips sink ships. Everybody's seen that. So this one's one Careless Talk got there first, so the paratrooper was killed on his way down because someone talked about the troop actions. All right, and there's pictures of men in their ships, and this man didn't make it, or people washing ashore because they didn't make it because someone talked. All right, or don't talk about troop actions. There's one, a great one, which has Mussolini, Hitler, and some other things with great big ears, and says the walls have ears. All right, there's one in which this beautiful woman says wanted for murder because she talked, and there's one with a rattlesnake. Careless talk or loose talk is more dangerous than the rattlesnake. So again, these are just different types of posters that we have at the museum. And again, what the purpose of what I wanted to bring them again is just to give you a chance to see some of the things that you would see at the museum. At the same time, maybe share with you some information that you weren't aware of in regards to World War I, World War II. And so hopefully we've given you some little things that at least now you know about dry dog food, and you know where hot dogs came from. And I probably, in a few minutes, I can think of something else, but I think I've probably given you enough for now. But I don't know, I've probably gone over time. I don't know what time it is, but if anybody has any questions, whatever time they have, I'll be glad to answer.